Well, hello and welcome to this RUSI Open to All event on gender safeguarding and criminality. My name is Stan Gilmore and I'm the director of the Thames Valley Violence Reduction Unit, and I'll be chairing today's panel session. This is the first in a series of webinars. We will be exploring issues around gender and organised crime, specifically looking at the roles that girls and women play within organised crime that may possibly be ignored by the way that we view girls and women and their relationships to criminality. Specifically today, we'll be looking at contextual safeguarding. So this basically is a view of how we can prevent girls and women from being drawn into organised crime. How can we promote their exit from organised crime by taking a view beyond the family unit into peer groups, into institutions and systems that may be set at the wrong angle for protecting girls and women. I'll mention some housekeeping to begin with. This is an open to all event. It's being recorded and live streamed, so please bear that in mind throughout the event. If you have any questions, and I hope you do, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and we'll monitor that and I'll try and feed them in through the session. The format today with our panelists is a zoom in from beginning with Dr. Liz Such, looking at the policy and practice frameworks that we may want to lean on to give us some insight from areas much wider than potentially policing or criminology. We will then follow through with some insight from Chief Superintendent Katie Barrow-Grint on the kind of operational view of managing safeguarding in these contexts. I'll say right now Katie is a busy operational police officer, so may have to be called away at any minute to deal with an incident. So if she disappears, it's not from lack of interest, she has a busy day job. And then Nicola Bell will give us some insight from her experience in going through the front door and speaking to the women and the men involved in organised crime, really at the kind of sharp end, and then we'll open up for questions. So I think with that introduction, I'll now hand over to Dr. Liz Such to just explain a little bit about the wider field. Liz, over to you.
Hi there. Thanks, Stan. Thanks very much for that introduction. So my background, just to give you a bit of an idea of where I'm coming from. So I'm a researcher at the University of Nottingham at the School of Health Sciences here in the Queen's Medical Centre in Nottingham, but I'm not a clinician, so I won't be asked to disappear off to deal with an emergency, which is good. But I've got a background in public health, in policy and in social inequalities. So I'm not a criminologist, but a researcher with a lot of experience of working on projects that relate to the benefits and the limitations of traditional law enforcement and criminal justice approaches to crimes of exploitation and of trafficking. So I work in the field of what's known now as modern slavery, and have particularly developed a public health approach to modern slavery in some of my work. So for me, having the luxury of being able to zoom out from the operational end of dealing with criminality, I'm going to present what I see as 3 key challenges to the audience and to the panel for over the next 5 and 10 minutes. And so just to tell you what those are to begin with, so you can start thinking. So first is that I think we need to think about gender, masculinities, femininities and identities, rather than just about women and girls. Okay, we don't solve gendered crime if we only use dominant frames, so the male perpetrator and the female victim. So that's my first challenge. The second one is about thinking about vulnerability as context, not as innate. And third, we need to go beyond what we currently see as the role of gender in crimes of exploitation. And I'll explain these in a bit more detail. So I spent quite a bit of time thinking about how to present this information, and I I managed to put it all down on paper, so forgive me if I appear if I'm reading a little of this. But I was reflecting that I'm not a safeguarding specialist, but I've learned quite a lot about protecting people and preventing harm in context through my public health background. So in public health, we know that the context within which people live fundamentally affects life chances, and as a consequence, people's health. So they're what we call the wider determinants of health. So some people die earlier than they should do in some parts of the UK, and we saw this during the pandemic really starkly, and it creates inequalities in health. And some people are involved in and are affected by crime more than others. So these must be the wider determinants of crime, with context exposing some more than others. We know then that the wider determinants of crime, as both those who perpetrate harm and those who experience harm, overlap significantly with the wider determinants of health. So living in a deprived area, not having paid employment, being excluded from school, all of these correlate to poor health and crime outcomes. But what about gender? Where does gender sit within all this? And do we have the same curiosity about the role of gender in crime as we do about those other factors that we perhaps feel more comfortable with? Do we rest on some dominant framings of the relationship between gender and crime a little too much? So here's my first challenge then. Are we a bit sloppy when it comes to thinking about gender? Do we understand it as a social construct and not something that is solely about women and girls, a women and girls issue? We all have a gender identity, obviously male, female, or otherwise. So what are the characteristics of these? How is it negotiated over time and space? And how does it relate to others' identities? How does it create and reproduce our criminal settings? Obviously, crime stats reveal that most offenders are men. Overwhelmingly, men come into contact with the police, the courts, the prison system. Crime is framed then as a male issue. And this is the starting point for a lot of people when they think about crime. It's also reflected in the policies in place and the services that we offer. It's a male frame, a male starting point. And so from this starting point and through this lens, we see women, dominant framings of the relationship between women and crime is one of women as victims. And the language of vulnerability comes in here. So women are framed as inherently vulnerable to crime, and women and girls so often are the victims of crime. But this leads me to my second challenge. And this is the language of internal individual vulnerability that needs exploring and certainly more carefully used. Vulnerability is a term used a lot without much definition. So there's a case to be more explicit. There are people who live in more vulnerable circumstances, and many women and girls often do, but there may also be circumstances when power, agency, and control is tangible and exercised. So what are those circumstances? What enables power and control, and how does it manifest? Can we spot these manifestations when crimes are committed by all genders? And as policymakers and service providers, how can we better enable power and agency when women and girls are at higher risk of things like coercion and exploitation? So when we look at examples of where power and agency are being exercised in my field, which is modern slavery and human trafficking, we look to the movement of survivorship, where agency and control is evident. So the reclaiming of lives through storytelling, through peer support, and crucially through justice and public recognition. Important steps like the Rotherham reviews have been critical in this process, and many fights obviously continue. So a third challenge then is to use the knowledge we have and go beyond it, to exercise more curiosity on the role of gender in all forms of criminal exploitation, including child exploitation, but also in county lines and more hidden forms of exploitation like domestic servitude, forced begging, and forced acquisitive crime, and forced benefit fraud. How is gender woven into these crimes, and how can we make this understanding more sophisticated and more visible? Obviously, as a researcher, I would argue for an evidence-led approach, but this involves thinking as well as data so that we make sure we ask the right questions and get the best answers. And this means seeing gender as about the ways in which it bestows powers and protection depending on context. So to summarise my 3 challenges, we need to think about gender rather than just women and girls. Second, we need to think about vulnerability as context, not as innate. And we need to go beyond what we currently see as the role of gender in crimes of exploitation. Thanks, Stan.
Liz, thank you. What a brilliant setup for what I'm hoping is going to be a really interesting conversation. So that's a really good way of getting us into the topic. Thank you. I'll now bring Katie in, Katie Barrow-Grint, for a bit of a view on a more operational perspective. And Katie, you've got a wide range of experience in related subjects, but I know you're not an expert on this particular topic, but we're really, really interested to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. And I've delved and dipped into this area for a long time, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my actual undergraduate research just to start off with. But my current role as the Force Lead for Violence Against Women and Girls in Thames Valley Police places that specific view, I think, in terms of the lens through which I look at this around women as victims and girls as victims, because invariably they are seen in that way, and invariably that, you know, the perpetrators that we focus on in this arena currently are men. But I think if I take people back to the year 2000, I don't know if you remember what you were doing then. When I joined police, and I just was writing just before I joined police, I was writing my dissertation at the London School of Economics. And I wanted to write around girl gangs and violence of girls, teenagers in particular. I'd just done my karate black belt, and I was really interested in violence and why so few women were engaged in the kind of sport of fighting, but then also why we didn't see that through an academic lens in terms of criminality either. So my dissertation was entitled "The Monstrous Regiment of Women," which was a phrase used by John Knox, a Scottish man in the 1500s. And he used that terminology because he really thought that it was unnatural for women to be able to lead. They were inferior to men. They were only capable of domestic acts such as bearing children. And it would be a wicked thought for women to be engaged in anything, let alone criminality or crime activity. And I think that has become part of the context in which we live. You know, we invariably feel as a society that women are not criminals, and our data would suggest that they are not. They are more often than not victims. But I think you can't look at any of this activity without looking at the intersectionality and the kind of reasons why women and girls can become involved in organised crime or violence, and why that is so. So, you know, it's very little theorised, women's use of violence. Often it becomes a moral panic when we talk about women as criminals, and it's very siloed. You either are or you aren't. And I think actually, you know, violence and aggression belong to the domain of men in terms of what we see, both practically and through the kind of criminological lens. And when you talk about women in this way, they are often seen as sick or desperate or irrational, rather than there being any sort of contextual reasons for why they become engaged or involved in criminality. So I think it's a really good opportunity for us to debate it. And I'm just listening to Liz then, it really sparks the brain in terms of thinking through how this plays out in terms of that operational activity. But I suppose I would ask the audience to think through a number of areas, in particular, the changing characteristics of organised crime, the new markets that we have, particularly around things like economic crime, cybercrime. We don't know the gender of the perpetrators of some of those types of criminal activity. And also, when we think about motivation or opportunity for criminal activity, is that something that women have agency to do? or is it something that they do because of the circumstance and the context in which they are living? So there are no easy answers to this, but some environments will present opportunities when serious organised crime may flourish, and actually women will become more engaged in that simply because of the context in which they live. And good examples of that are some of the modern slavery activity, particularly in countries where labour rights are not enforced, as an example. But I think, historically, women have always played active roles in serious organised crime. I just don't think we've unpicked it enough. We've not lifted the stone to delve into it. And you see that through the lack of research. You see that through the lack of data. And the data that we have is very engendered. And so it's hidden from us in terms of really understanding the reasons why women and girls are involved. So my kind of specialist subject currently is I write on domestic abuse, and I've been doing some work recently researching domestic abuse linked to gang violence, because traditional domestic violence research doesn't account for victims of gang abusers. And what I've started to uncover is that, and many of you will kind of say, well, it's obvious, but women and girls who are in relationships with gang members find it really difficult to report any violence or any offending, notably because there is the wrath of the perpetrator, but also there's the wrath of the gang. The context in which they survive means that they have difficulties in terms of their own personal ability to be safeguarded. But what we do know is that women aged 16 to 19 are more likely to experience domestic abuse than all other age groups. And I think when you explore it in this context around prevention and I think it was your words earlier, Stan, around the promotion of how you exit yourself or try and get help to exit yourself from these types of environments. This is where we need to start unpicking how we support victims, but also within those environments, those victims can become part of the gang, sometimes in order to survive, sometimes because they have motivation or opportunity, or the context is right. And actually, what can we do from a policing perspective, but also from a societal perspective, to start thinking through how this contextual safeguarding is so important. And you can't just silo somebody and say they are a victim, they are a perpetrator. I think you're right, Liz, in terms of that. We need to look at it from an overarching gender perspective more than anything else. I'll stop there, Stan. I've kind of waffled on, and probably not with particularly in terms of giving you some clear examples of where this fits, but I think that will come out in the Q&A in terms of some of the things I'll be able to describe.
Yeah, but a perfect summary, though, I think, Katie. Framing the problem as it comes down from a kind of policy perspective into the difficulty we have in thinking about exit strategies with a gender lens. So absolutely, and I'm hoping we'll get some questions. I've got a few anyway, but moving on to Nicola now. Nicola Bell going to talk to us about really the sharp end of this and how it looks and feels up close. Nicola.
Hi, thanks, Stan. Good afternoon, everybody. So what I'm going to talk about is due to my experience, my observations over the years, but also from speaking to victims and perpetrators in exploitation. So human trafficking and exploitation are often viewed as offences committed by men, and that women are always the victims. And there's always a clear distinction that seems to be made between perpetrators and victims. So a victim can never be a perpetrator, so therefore a woman can never be a perpetrator. If a woman is found to be a perpetrator, it's often assumed that they were or still are a victim of themselves, and sometimes they are. It could be that they've been given more responsibilities by the gang, but the same coercion and threats are used into making them do the things that they don't want to do. In situations where there are also male perpetrators involved, then the woman is often viewed as the girlfriend or the wife of the male, and they are supporting and assisting the male in whatever they're instructed to do. And it's often found that women can recruit people into exploitation much easier because they can gain more trust, but also what male perpetrators do is use like female characteristics, as I call it. So they're often seen as quite mothering and friendly. So they're often looking after the victims as well. But women who are exploited into being perpetrators are actually in the minority. The majority of women who are exploiters have prominent roles to play and are often the ones who are organising the exploitation or trafficking rings and managing the running of it. There's been a few high-profile cases recently, all women perpetrators. Joanna Gomlusaka trafficked 29 vulnerable people from Slovakia and exploited them. Julia Laura was convicted of keeping a woman in slavery, and Fazana Kazar enslaved a woman for 16 years. And then obviously the high profile case of Mo Farrow's situation, that was a woman perpetrator as well. And locally, in some of the work I've been doing recently, of 10 of the most recent cases I've worked on, 7 were women perpetrators in those cases, and they were mainly around sexual exploitation. So we had what we call madams running brothels, we've got labour exploitation, and also domestic servitude, and all of them were women perpetrators. And the commonality between all those perpetrators, the motive was financial. That's what it's all been about. And I sometimes have got frustrated over the years because if we've done operations with the police or any other multi-agencies, it's kind of men to the left and handcuffed, women to the right and debriefed. And I've often said, you know, if we're going into a brothel or any males, arrest them. And I'm like, why? Why do we have to arrest the males? Because actually, often than not, in a brothel, it is actually the males there that are victims because they're being made to run that brothel. And what we find is that in some cases we have what we call alpha victims, where there is a person who's actually part of the gang, part of that management of it, but are planted to make them look like a victim. So if there is any police operations or activity, then they can stay with all the other women and basically, you know, threaten them or be their translator or whatever. And every alpha victim I've ever come across in 9 years has always been a woman. One of the things I always say, the easiest to do, and it's going back to what Liz and Katie were saying about looking at overarching factors. When I deliver training, the most important message I want people to take away is to look at the indicators of slavery and not the people, because I think it's human nature when we look at people, whether that's age, gender or ethnicity, then it leads to assumptions and misconceptions and actually how it's dealt with as well. And I think that goes for both perpetrators and victims. As long as we look at the indicators, then we're going to identify modern slavery. So I think finally, in summary, what I would like to say is I think if women are wrongly not regarded as perpetrators, we are enabling that message to be put out there that women in exploitation are always viewed as victims. So for me, this creates more opportunities and makes it easier for the continuation of people being exploited by those who are going identified as the real criminals in these cases. Thank you.
We can't hear you, Stan, or I can't.
Hi everyone, we appear to have, I can see you, Stan, but I can see your mouth moving, but for some reason we can't hear you. I'm not sure why that is. Thank you to all our speakers. If Stan's sound suddenly works again, we'll pass back to him. He's going to log out and log back in again. Thank you, Stan. I'm Genevieve Kataska. I'm a research analyst in the Organised Crime and Policing team, and I've organised this series of events, so I will stand in quickly. Thank you to our speakers. There have been some questions come through that I'm going to have a look at in a second. But firstly, I wanted to ask if there are any good examples of how gender has been mainstreamed that our speakers could give, because we've heard a lot about what's wrong. Are there any success stories out there?
Genevieve, hi. I was just reading some of the questions there, but some, I think, just to reflect on what, the fields where we can learn to have better attentiveness to gender is certainly the domestic violence field and violence against women and girls. These debates are never resolved, and nor should they be. There should always be live discussion, because gender shifts and changes as over time. But certainly the introduction of the notion of coercive control in the domestic violence sphere is as the product of a stronger and clearer understanding of gender relations and power relations. And it can be applied, I think, to, and has been applied to, some research in the county line sphere when referring to women and girls' experience in county lines. I think there's also just slightly more some interesting areas that show attentiveness to gender as a whole, so not a women and girls issue, and more as a whole of society issue. And that would be some of the discussions and interventions around school projects on things like consent, which includes boys and girls, and does try and encourage a sensible and grown-up discussion about gender relations, relationships between boys and girls, and so accounts for gender, not just it being a girls' issue. There are other sites of discussion and resistance, so sex worker rights, reproductive rights, and domestic workers' rights. So I think there are some good examples from which we can draw, and a lot of it's about having these sorts of sensible discussions about it being a whole of society discussion, rather than something which is just for women and girls.
And Katie, Nicola, have you seen anything on the more operational end that's working particularly well?
Yeah, I think there is some good work going on around some of the data analytics and robotics that picks up some of this, particularly when you look at social network analysis. So not looking at your kind of Facebook and your Twitter and things like that, but that real kind of engaged review of the network in which an individual is linked to, and how you can then extrapolate that out and make it less gendered, because you're looking at the intelligence, you're looking at the data, you're looking at the context. I think for me, though, because our data is quite gendered, or there is an absence of data to a certain extent around some of this activity, it can make it tricky. But I have seen some good work, particularly within our multi-agency safeguarding hubs, where they are able to kind of have that broader oversight and that helps unpick some of these discussion points.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, Stan,
Yes,
I'll
I've
pass
got
back
some.
over to you.
No, the benefits of technology. Thank you, Jenny. So we have a couple of questions in the chat. One from Helen, talking about how sexual exploitation is enabled by online platforms and how can a public health approach or public health approaches influence online platforms to reduce content. And we've got the examples that we've seen most recently around the kind of toxic masculinity that's been promoted by the likes of Andrew Tate. Katie, I wonder if from your kind of wider experience, whether you've had any engagement with online platforms, and you can maybe give us some insight into any success you might have had.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a huge issue for policing, let alone society, and it is difficult to be able to influence some of those national or international online platforms, but they are becoming more engaged. And I think what we are seeing with the Violence Against Women and Girls agenda in particular is that you can see the stark difference between the activity around upstanders versus the activity around individuals who are trying to promote the misogynistic, sexist language and activity that we see. And I think Helen's put in the chat around Andrew Tate, and that's a really good example. I think we have to take it back a step, though, from policing, from that reaction about let's take something down or let's try and influence, and take it right back to the beginning. This is about education, and I'm seeing a lot of stuff, both in the conversations I'm having locally, but also in terms of the national debate around the education piece in schools and how we are able to influence boys, adolescent boys in particular, around what is the norm. I mean, it was just on the radio this morning saying that over a quarter of primary school children have seen online pornographic image before they leave school aged 11. Now, I've got a 10-year-old. That horrifies me in terms of the context in which they think relationships, sexual activity, friendships even should progress. And actually, what more can we do at that early intervention stage to have those discussions for very young children, right up through teenage years, to try and have some articulate discussion about why this isn't right. And we see this in the kind of domestic abuse sphere. So it wasn't until 2020 that it's become a statutory requirement in legislation for schools to have discussions around relationships, domestic abuse in adolescent relationships, this kind of activity. Yet we've had COVID since then, and we've not had that opportunity at a national level to embed some of this education and prevention activity. So I think it's all, saying we need to stop it at the top end in terms of getting it off social media. It's a wicked problem. It's never going to happen. We've got to reframe it, start from the beginning, and think through how are we educating our responsibilities as parents, as teachers, as professionals across all environments.
Thanks, Katie. Absolutely, push and pull factors undoubtedly playing the part. Just for the audience's benefit, next month's event, we'll be looking at gender, crime and social media. So we'll have a deeper dive into this topic. Please join us then. We have a question from Joanna around, do we see disparities in the percentage of females engaging in criminal behaviour depending on the type of organised crime? I can answer that very quickly myself. I don't know if anybody else wants to pick it up, but yes, we do see differences depending on the kind of typology of crime, and it varies from country to country as well. But largely, we see huge differences in male and female representation, which tend to dominate the statistics. So we don't really see a reversal of that anywhere. We don't see organised crime where you have more women dominating than men. It's always the other way around by a wide margin. But yes, there are differences. If anyone wants to come in on that, please feel free. We have a question from Eleonora, which I think is asking, do we have any observations? Nicola, this is for you. Do we have any observations on migrants being exploited for their benefits? I think that's saying in the context of modern slavery. I think you mentioned, you touched on this as you were discussing it, but would you like to expand?
Yeah, so we see a lot of migrants, especially vulnerable to exploitation. Certainly in Oxfordshire, where I work, there is a big, it's an OCG, but not as probably people realise it, but it is a group of people who specifically target the hotels where they're staying at, and offer them money because they don't get very much money, offer them work because obviously they get cash in hand, work illegally, and they're mainly put into things like forced begging. So we'd see a lot of migrants begging around particularly market towns. Because a lot of the migrants are mainly males, it's sometimes also for labour exploitation. So we often get companies wanting cheaper labour. So again, we'll approach migrants. So yeah, they are very vulnerable to being exploited and targeted.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any further questions in the Q&A tab. So please jump in and ask some questions, because you've got a great panel in front of you. Liz, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to follow up on that point around forced benefit fraud, I think it's one of those under the radar, hidden yet potentially huge problems, and one of the ways that one location in the UK was trying to address it was by through partnerships. So a third sector organisation partnering with a local bank, so that people who were trying to open bank accounts to receive a wage the third sector organisation was training bank staff to recognise the signs of people that were opening bank accounts with other people at present, where it was possible that they were being taken to banks to open bank accounts, so that money could be emptied from those bank accounts, so that they, didn't necessarily have that kind of control over their own money. That was for, again, labour exploitation. More on benefit fraud, forced benefit fraud. There were other reports from local GPs about potential coercion of children to present to GP practices with conditions. So the potential that children were being involved or being coerced into going to GP practices so that parents could receive benefits, and those benefits were being taken by organised criminal gangs as part of a much broader network of general exploitation, which included labour exploitation, could have included sexual exploitation too, because of course there's kind of like a no limits. It's not just one type. You won't necessarily limit yourself to one type of exploitation, but potentially multiple. So that there are those kind of, that sort of intelligence is available at the local level, but I don't know how that sort of intelligence could be coordinated or used as research data to explore these things.
Thank you, Liz. Sorry, trouble to get off mute there. Thank you. Well, we have a question from Lee then, talking again about toxic masculinity. How are organisations tackling radicalised individuals seeking to join protection teams in positions of trust, I guess, whilst holding misogynistic views? Seems that society is seeking to shut the conversation down as opposed to facing it. So are we tackling this problem head on, of people with the wrong kind of mindset joining I guess the police and other organisations? Katie Thorney topic, very relevant in the current conversations, especially around kind of systemic inequalities. And what we see is that you don't necessarily have to have the visible characteristics of misogyny or other issues to kind of land within a system that maybe promotes it rather than preventing it. So any thoughts from you, Katie?
Yeah, well, I think it's a really good question, and one we are frankly struggling with nationally, around, particularly within the police service, how you unpick that, because we all know the service should reflect the communities it serves, and yet you're right, Stan, you don't have a visible representation necessarily that says you're sexist, misogynistic, or have those characteristics, to make it easy for us. And vetting only goes so far, and we know that people can hide their true feelings. We've seen that around race over the years. We're seeing it around sexism and misogyny now, and it will be around other protected characteristics as well. So I think it's a wicked question. There is no answer to some of this, but we have to do more to tackle it. And that's not only the training, the creation of healthy team cultures, the trying to be an upstander, not a bystander. As an organisation, we're white ribbon accredited. We have the men in our organisation standing up, saying enough is enough. That's one part of it. But the second part of it is enabling our staff and our communities to be able to say, that's not right. There is something about that individual that causes concern, and you need to be proactive around dealing with that. So I think, you can come at it from all angles, be it education, be it that reactive capability to deal with it. I think what we're getting to is the point where we say, people are being much braver in coming forward now. And I feel reassured that my colleagues would stand up and say something. I have examples just in force this week where a female has been at a football match in a policing capacity, and one of the stewards has been sexist and misogynistic towards her. She's a senior officer. One of her colleagues, very junior officer, has stood up for her, said that's not right, has recorded it as a hate incident. It's not a hate crime, so she's not a hate crime currently. So I think we are getting there in terms of that upstander behaviour, but we need everybody to get on board with that, and we need to be able to take that constructive criticism and work with it and think through where we can get better.
Thanks, Katie, and I'll come back with a supplemental in a second. Lee's saying thank you, but Anthony, for you, Liz, Anthony Evans is saying, I guess, thank you, because the observations that you're making are similar to ones that have been made earlier by PCC Mark Burns-Williamson at an event. My guess is you might even have been at that event, Liz, but it's nice to see that there is continuity there. Katie, if I can come back to you briefly, just on the points that you raise around what you're doing about the kind of more obvious impacts. I wonder if you've got any observations on perhaps how that might translate into the less obvious. So we can tackle head on misogyny, hate, etc. But I think we've heard from Nicola and from Liz the kind of pervasive issues around identity, justice, recognition, inclusion. How do you think, from your broad experience, we might want to frame just a different way of thinking about some of the more subtle elements rather than those that we need to tackle head on? Are you looking at that in your work? Any thoughts?
Yeah, so I think you have to be quite careful that you don't silo some of this activity and make it about one thing. So you can talk about violence against women and girls from a policing perspective. You can talk about the race action plan from a policing perspective. Actually, what we're talking about here is culture and trust and confidence of our communities in that culture. And I think actually the way you reframe it is by asking different questions. And I think sometimes we don't have the time, or sometimes the the ability, I suppose, to ask the right questions. And I'm not here to say what those right questions are, but having that kind of ability as leaders, but as also individuals within an organization, to say this is really complex, so we need to have a debate, we need to have a discussion, we need to unpick, and we need to ask people what they think they can do to help move this forward. Because if we don't prevent it, it will get worse. We have to deal with the reactionary piece as well, but this overlays into all of that complex activity we were talking about right at the beginning, around how you contextualize this in order to prevent it, but also to promote exit from it, and make sure that we are capable as a organization, but also as a society, to make it better. It's really tricky. That there is no, if we had the right answer, we would, we'd all be following it now. If there was a light bulb moment, we'd be there. But this is why events like this are good, because it's starting that debate. I haven't got all the answers as a lead in Thames Valley. Nobody has. But if anyone's got good suggestions, then please, talk to us, come forward and work with us.
Well, let's take that challenge up, and I'll move this same question across to you, Nicola. You mentioned your observations, women on the left, men on the right, offenders, victims, etc. Do you have any insight about how we might be able to shift the dial a little bit, so that we're not only tackling those most obvious, misogynistic or other perspectives, but the kind of more entrenched, more kind of common values driven agenda? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, really reiterate what Katie says, but I think going back to what I said about people being less focused on the issue of gender or age or ethnicity, and focus on what the evidence that's there, what are the indicators. And I think we need to do that in every organisation, anybody who's supporting people, because we need to get away from stereotyping as well. And I think stereotyping people does create misogyny, etc. So for me, it's like kind of forgetting all of those gender, age, ethnicity, and just looking at what's in front of us.
Thanks, Nicola. And sticking with you, Nicola, we've got a question. Is criminalisation the answer? I would say no. But
no.
So how should gender be included in hate crime? Should misogyny be a hate crime? Do you want to expand? I would say quickly no as well, but is criminalisation ever the answer?
Is that for me? Sorry.
For you, Nicola, sorry.
No, I don't think criminalisation is the answer. I think it creates more opportunities, I would say, and sometimes criminalising things drive things underground as well, so it'd be less identified. So no.
Thank you. And we have an observation that analysts are vital for helping police understand contextualised safeguarding, but they're vastly underused. I think we'd all agree that analysis is important. I would say as well that data's under available as well. So whereas we want more analysis, we want better analysis, we want better data. Katie, you oversee an element of this in Thames Valley. Any other thoughts on analysis?
Yeah, so there's a really good podcast, a Reducing Crime podcast by Jerry Ratcliffe, that looks at the value and use of analysis. And I remember listening to it and thinking, you're absolutely right, because I think, quite often analysts are used in terms of that reactionary, look at data, analyse it, provide us with what is happening, rather than look at the data and provide us with a view on what will happen, what does the future look like, where do we need to change what we're doing in order to prevent or deal with up and coming issues. So I do think we need to reflect and reframe to a certain extent how we use some of our analytical capability, and that's across policing. I'm not talking specifically about TVP here, but in Thames Valley, what we have done is created problem solving analysts who work within our neighbourhood function, and are that key individual that is looking across the partnership data, the internal policing data, and trying to provide that context that we're all talking about here around the individuals that need the most focus, and where that focus should come from, because it's not always about policing, but sometimes unless you've had that umbrella oversight, you don't know quite where to focus the individual's problems. So I think there's lots of scope for analytical work, and I think there's probably something around training police leaders in particular about how and when to use analysts and the value that they can bring, and we're getting there. And I think if any of you know Dr. Emma Williams, who's currently at the OU, I've had quite a number of debates with her around this. She's very interested in the role of an analyst, having been an analyst in the Met previously. But we do need to work on that as a profession, really, about the value that they can bring.
Thank you, Katie. And if I can move this across to Liz, because we're also interested in research, not just analysis. And we would hope that research prompts good analysis in the way that Katie's described. Where do you think maybe we could learn from other disciplines that are looking at kind of similar type issues, or any gaps, or any just wider observations on the role of research and practice?
Yeah, I mean, I used to be a social researcher, so an analyst for Department for Work and Pensions quite some time ago now, but there we used analysis consistently. I would say we were in analysis and policy mixed teams, so we had statisticians, economists, social researchers, operational researchers embedded it together in one team, and I think that model was helpful in not just producing the kinds of information people wanted to make sensible policy decisions, but actually helping ask the right questions. And I go back to that point about asking good questions to get the most from data and analysis. And I think that's where researchers can really help. It can be a bit annoying at times, but asking good questions is a really important part, a prerequisite to good analysis. And on that point, I suppose one of my interests is in how we use that model across sectors. So as a researcher, as a former government analyst, I have tried to work with local authorities, for example, to support knowledge mobilization. So using all the knowledge available to us, including research evidence and statistics and more local forms of knowledge to drive better decision making. So decision making that suits a local area. And it's a very difficult model to use because it's not really supported by the infrastructures of universities or by government departments, to work across universities and government departments or local government or the police, in fact, where it's actually quite hard to gain access, the sort of access that you want and need to be able to provide the best answers to the most sensible questions. So I would say that model needs to change, but I also wanted to reinforce the need to talk to the people that know the most, who are survivors of exploitation and people who have done harm through perpetration, and building that into building the right questions with researchers and with analysts, and then providing the right sorts of answers. So it's a complex picture that requires triangulation across people and across different sources of information, and I'm kind of up for that challenge, and is very much a kind of public health way of looking at dealing with these sort of wicked problems.
Thank you. And I think we're getting close to the end now, but we've got a couple of observations from Adriano around early intervention and prevention in schoolwork. I can begin to answer that. If anyone else wants to pop in, then they may. Certainly locally in the Thames Valley, we have a child-centered practice lead within our violence reduction unit who has a particular view on working within schools, not just for social skills and relationships education, but as a way of building bridges with schools, which we know that education, being in school, is a very strong preventive factor for all sorts of things. So yes, we have examples of where that works, including where a kind of public health approach to trauma-informed schools is working really well in other countries as well. So there are examples of really strong practice there. And the UN guidance around mainstreaming gender is absolutely there and runs across a number of different programs, including ones that we might want to focus on, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, not least within this context. So yeah, there is a transnational emphasis on this, and it's something that we need to be catching up on. Comment in here from Anthony as well. N8 Policing Research Partnership. I've been involved with them. I think you have as well, Katie, maybe others have. Held a data knowledge mobilisation in Leeds in 2019, which involves several other northern universities, and details are on their website. Thank you, Anthony. We know that there are a number of research areas and groups that are looking at this agenda, and we're keen through this webinar series to perhaps pull some of that into this discussion and promote it going into the future. Now we're down to the last few minutes. I will mention again the next webinar, which is looking at social media, and this is the first in a series of 5 webinars each month. So please keep a lookout for the topics that we'll be following through in coming webinars. I think I've got time to. There's no more questions I'm seeing coming up on the screen, so I've probably got time to just throw. Oh, we've got one here. Oh, thank you very much. Probably got time just to finish off with you, Nicola. And have you got any observations on the prevention pathways that work the best from your perspective? What does good look like when you see it up close?
So prevention of exploitation.
Yeah.
For me, it's a multi-agency approach. There is no one organisation can do it on their own, and certainly in Oxfordshire we've got a new structure that involves lots of key partners, and that multi-agency approach to identify victims, safeguard victims and plan disruption. So I would say hands down multi-agency approaches.
You know what I think about that. So
yeah.
Yes, absolutely agree. Tackling systemic inequalities can only be done through a whole systems multi-agency approach, and we often have a different term for systemic inequalities. We often call them vulnerabilities, which is a bit of kind of victim blaming from my perspective, because people are only really vulnerable when they don't have access to the systems that they need to provide them with support and security. So it's a systemic issue, and the only way to kind of rise above it and to deal with it is to take that whole systems approach. Katie's mentioned a couple of times now the wickedness of these problems. We can really only hope, at least in the short term, to do our best to make things better, rather than expect that we're going to solve things overnight. But the only way I think we can tackle this is by working together and listening to the voices of those with authentic experience, and to try and figure out as leaders perhaps within systems how we can get their voices embedded into our practice, and make sure that we can move away from just the assumptions that are often made that lead people into vulnerability by not seeing what's happening to them. So on that, I will round up. If nobody else has any questions for the last few seconds, and I'm not seeing anyone, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to RUSI for hosting what has been a really interesting conversation, and I hope you can all join us For the next webinar, we'll be looking at issues around gender, organised crime and social media. And we've got a few thank yous coming up. And yeah, with that, I will say goodbye. Thank you, everyone.